Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you part one of a two-part review series on the Fujinon XF 90mm f2, and this is R for aperture ring, it is LM for linear motors, and it is WR for being weather resistant. All of those things pretty much are things that were missing when I did my review of the 56mm f1.2. And I did that review a couple of months ago, and I had a lot of feedback during that review process of those of you telling me, Dustin, you need to look at the 90mm. It is, it's maybe a better lens in some of those areas when it comes to the quality of the autofocus and the autofocus motor and having the weather sealing, some of those key features that I felt like were missing on a $1,000 portrait-oriented lens. And so obviously some of those things are addressed here in the 90mm f2, but what we're going to do today is in part one here, we're going to look at the build, the features, look at what's here, and then we're also going to take a look at the image quality. In part two, we're going to take a look at the autofocus performance. We're going to look how it does for video, look at a few more photos as a part of that, and I'll render my final verdict as a part of that, along with providing you with a text review for you to look at as well. So right now, what we're going to do first of all is we're going to jump in and we're going to take a hands-on look at the build, the handling, the features, and the design of this lens. Let's take a look. Okay, so let's take a closer peek at the Fujinon 90mm f2. And so this is on this Fuji X-T3 body. This is the equivalent, according to Fuji, of 137mm. So obviously the crop factor isn't perfectly at 1.5 times. If you look at this from a 1.5 times crop factor, it's perfectly 135mm. And so, I mean, there's obviously just a tiny bit of play there in the actual crop factor. But what you've got is a lens that is going to cover the classic 135mm focal length on full frame. And so what we have here is a reasonably compact lens, particularly for covering this particular focal length. And just to give you a visual comparison here, this is the Viltrox 85mm f1.8. Now, this is actually the Sony FE version, but to my knowledge, it is actually identical in size to the one that's available for Fuji. And so as you can see in terms of the basic overall length dimensions, it's just a hair shorter. It's a little bit wider around in circumference, and that's reflected by the fact that you have a 72mm front filter thread on the Viltrox, whereas on the Fuji, you actually have a 62mm front filter thread, and so a little bit smaller around in diameter. So taking a look at those specifications, the diameter here is 2.95 inches or 75mm, 4.13 inches in length. That's 105mm in its total length. Now the weight is moderate, 1.2 pounds or 540 grams, and it balances fine on the X-T3 body that I have it mounted on. It comes with a pretty generic plastic lens hood here. It's ribbed on the inside. It doesn't feel particularly premium. I will note that. Feels actually fairly cheap. It also does not necessarily lock particularly well, at least the one I have here, when it bayonets into place. So not the best lens hood that I've ever seen there. We have 7 rounded aperture blades inside. They are controlled by the aperture ring here, so you can either put that into A for automatic, control it from within the camera body, or you can physically select your aperture values in 1/3 stop detents. This is still electronic aperture, and so right now it's not going to change the actual aperture shape, but if the camera is on, it becomes a different story, and as you can see, there's a little bit of lag in between there as I make changes, because that's because it's taking electronic input. The same is true if we are manually focusing, in that focus is focus by wire, so focus input on the focus ring, which is nicely ribbed, feels like a metal focus ring, nicely ribbed and moves nicely. And so you have the ability, of course, to set this up linear as an option inside the camera body, and so that does help. But it is focused by wire, so again, focus input will go through the focus motor. Byproduct of that is that you've got to make a lot of rotations to make major focus changes, and so just be aware of that if you're wanting to make a significant focus change. Now, the lens can focus down to 1.97 feet, so right under 2 feet, right at 60 centimeters. And there it has a 0.2 0.20 times magnification, which Fuji says, interestingly, that it's the equivalent of a 0.30 times magnification in 35 millimeter terms. And so in that optical formula, there are 11 elements and 8 groups in the optical formula. That includes 3 extra low dispersion elements. It also has super EBC coatings to the individual elements to reduce lens flare. It also has a quad linear motor design here. So quite a sophisticated focus motor, and that helps to give it faster and quieter autofocus as compared to, particularly the 56 millimeter. I just reviewed the 56 millimeter f1.2. Wasn't really blown away by the autofocus, and this is definitely quieter in operation because of the quad linear motors that are a part of that. Now, if we disconnect here for a second, you will find there is a gasket here that's part of the internal weather sealing. This is a WR, which means that it has weather resistance. It actually has 7 different seal points inside the body and is designed to be used in cold conditions. Good news for those of us that live here in Canada. So as you can see, definitely some improvements over the 56 millimeter that I reviewed. And as I already noted, some of the features that are there that weren't there before. Fuji has pretty much a working formula for their lenses that I think definitely works. The combination of having the aperture ring and the ability to auto-select the aperture. Probably the only thing that someone might look for in that's missing is the ability to declick an aperture for some video work. That's not there. But other than that, these are, lenses that do have some features to them. There's not ever an AF-MF switch, and that's because Fuji does control that from the body, and there's a dedicated switch for that. Now, of course, what people are probably most interested in is the image quality. And so we're going to take a look at the image quality of this and see if it holds up as an optical design. Let's jump in and let's take a look. So let's take a look at Distortion and Vignette, of which, at least in the form of which it arrives to you either in JPEG or RAW, there really isn't anything there to see. Their corrections are baked into even their raw images. And so anyway, we'll be able to just take it on its merit. What we find too is if we look in the center of the frame, we have got great amounts of sharpness and resolution there. And if we look at our corners, the corners and edges of the frame, I'll just kind of scroll up to the top here. You can see that they are pretty much the same, and also same here on the left side. We've got strong centering. We've got very good performance across the frame. To give you an idea of how that translates into the real world, as you can see, our actual resolution is not only excellent, but our contrast is excellent as well. And in this situation where there is potential for chromatic aberrations, you see that they are well corrected for, and a beautiful result, very soft bokeh rendering. This image gives us a little even clearer picture of how longitudinal chromatic aberrations are handled. You've got white edges with a transition towards a dark background. And as you can see, they are just perfectly well controlled. There isn't any visible, longitudinal CA to be seen in this picture. So if we compare f2 to f2.8, you can see we do have an uptick in contrast. And so you can just see darker areas look darker, bright areas look a little bit brighter, so increased contrast. Out into the corners as well, you can just see that, the corners look really fantastic. And so by comparison, you can see that there was a very light haze on the textures due to lower contrast. But truth of the matter is it already looked good. It looks exceptional at f2.8. To give you an idea of how that bears out in a real world scene here, we can see looking at these trees, and again, lots of potential for chromatic aberration. You've got snow on the ground, you've got the birch trees that have a kind of a bright white trunk, and then here you can just see everything looks really, really fantastic. I'm a fan of the contrast levels out of this lens. Produces really beautiful images. If we go from f2.8 to f4, we do see even a further uptick of contrast. Contrast looks better yet. Into the corner of the frame, you can see again, contrast is just a little bit better. We're not really adding a lot of resolution, but you can see that the contrast has improved by stopping the lens down. f5.6, shockingly, you see a similar pattern. You'd see still an uptick in the contrast and thus apparent resolution. And in each kind of successive shot, it looks like, you know, you've just dialed it up a little bit higher. So this is a lens that has a lot in the tank when it comes to contrast and resolution. And it's not until f8 that we see that taper off. And so you can see that there isn't really any advantage going from f5.6 to f8. In fact, I would say if anything, there is just the smallest regression, just a tiny bit in some of the areas where I'm looking in the frame. And so you can see here to here, just a little bit less contrast. So f5.6 seems to represent maximal contrast and resolution. Now, if you push on further back past that, minimum aperture is f16. We can see that even at f2, you've got better contrast and resolution than what you do at f16. And so, you know, smaller apertures, you start to lose once again. You're going to peak at f5.6. Now, while I'm not dealing with the most colorful time of the year, you can see that both color and bokeh is very nice here. And again, with these bare branches, opportunities for chromatic aberrations, they are just really, really well controlled. Nice resolution on the shot. Here's another beautiful shot here that just shows how nicely that the background can melt away. You can get nice and close to a subject and completely blur out a background, and you can see even at f2 you've got really crisp delineations in all those transition areas from focus to the defocused area. Here's a shot with some people in it. Again, this is at f2, and what you can see is, again, we've got nice contrast. You can see the snowflakes in the air. Looking to a background which is now more at a medium distance, you can see that it's handled well, you know, fringing in the bokeh areas, and you can see that the bokeh itself looks nice here, even though there's not a huge, you know, distance from the subject to the background. Subject being about halfway in between camera distance and background distance. Here is a medium focus shot, and so this both shows us the rich color that the lens is capable of, but also shows us, even if we're out of kind of typical portrait range, even wide open, you can see that the contrast holds up really nice here across the frame, and chromatic aberrations well controlled. This is a very strong lens optically. Now here's a portrait shot, shows how skin tones are nicely handled and the color looks really nice. And detail is good here. I did find in this portrait series that even though I thought I was shooting at a safe shutter speed, that there was a little bit of a tendency towards motion blur. And so on a focal length as long as this, I definitely miss not having either OSS in the lens or having in-body image stabilization to offset just that slightest bit of camera shake. Here's another shot here, and so it goes to show, you know, how narrow depth of field is here, even though their faces are close together. That, you know, couple of inches difference in the, you know, positioning of their faces means that, you know, this girl's eye is starting to go out of focus. But as you can see, skin tones are nicely handled, a very nice portrait lens. Now in our hands-on section, we noted that there's two specifications that are given by Fuji. So just as a comparison, here's the Zeiss Milvus, which has a magnification of 0.25. And so clearly it, you know, Fuji is right, and I think that it would be clearer to just list what is the actual reproduction ratio instead of having two figures, 0.20 and 0.30, to just use the 0.30, because in real world, you know, magnification, this is what it boils down to. So you can see it can definitely have a higher magnification level than what the Milvus does. Now, to be fair, this is actually a shot on the Canon EOS R, so ever so slightly higher resolution, 2 megapixels, but you can see that at minimum focus distance, the Milvus is pretty exceptional, definitely a much higher resolving. Not bad here from the Fuji, but, you know, of course, this is a fantastic lens, and the Fuji can't quite match the performance at minimum focus. Now, as you can see, flare resistance is rarely a strength for a 135mm lens with a large aperture, and that's true here also. We can see that wide open, there's definitely some veiling. You can see that contrast is reduced across the frame. You can also see that there is some kind of prismatic haze here. Not the end of the world, it's still usable and maybe even stylistic. Now when stopped down on the right here, this is at f11. Again, there is a pretty distinctive ghosting pattern, and maybe that's an artistic look that you're going to like. At the same time, you definitely can't argue that it's non-destructive. It's definitely a look, and so you're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. But that is one area of vulnerability for this lens. So as you can see, outside of maybe some weakness when it comes to flare resistance, this is a lens that has a lot of optical strengths. It's very good resolution across the frame consistently. It gets even better when stopped down. It has good contrast, good chromatic aberration control. Doesn't really have any issues with distortion, doesn't have any real issue with vignette, at least in the way that it arrives to you in camera. And so, a lot of good things going on there, and I think it delivers really beautiful results in a lot of settings. And we'll discuss that more in our final episode, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, however, there is an image gallery. If you want to go look at more photos from the lens in advance of our final episode, you can take a look at that. There's also buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. Also linkage if you'd like to follow me on social media or become a patron, sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.